Good afternoon. Dzień dobry. Opowiadanie jest rano. Panie ambasadorze, panie profesorowie, szanowni gości, koledzy, welcome. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure as always, and I say to our Latvian colleagues, Lippity, always good to be here. I look back at a journey, and I will take about a half hour of your time. So those who are thinking, when can I plan to have my lunch? About a half hour. Who would you know? To Ambassador Konicki's comments about the Polish cavalry, in delving into this riddle, which was the start of my doctorate in Polish cavalry, Polish armor, was to disabuse people of this myth of the Polish cavalry in the Battle of Kryante. And as well displayed, there were two reporters that were on location the day after the battle occurred. There was an Italian correspondent from La Domenica del Corriere and William L. Schreier, an American correspondent, who later on went to write The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, published in 1959. Neither one of them were present the day the battle occurred. They interviewed a German officer the next day, and what had actually happened, as well displaying, was a dismounted German unit was attacked by Polish cavalry under the 18th Uhlans, Pomorski, under Mastalerz, Colonel Mastalerz. That's what actually happened. While they were attacking, another Polish armored unit happened upon the unit attacking. And so they were attacked by a subsequent German unit. The reason I mention this, and this segue into what I'd like to talk about, is perfect, and this often happens in conferences when you see people furiously writing that are going to present and trying to link together the different topics that we're talking about. Because this myth of Polish cavalry being crazy, being suicidal, is a myth that continued throughout the Second War and further. So when it came to who gets to fight with the Poles or alongside the Poles, senior British officers and Canadian had the myth that the Poles are crazy, they're suicidal, do we want to fight with them? So I'll link this together. First of all, I'd like to, a week ago when I was briefing a group of junior officers, they asked me about mentorship and about leadership. And I said to them, and it's of course, it's on my honor, I said, I have a mentor I've had for many years, well over 20 years. And he's a gentleman called Mieczysław Pieszczynowski, this gentleman right here. Everything I know about leadership I've learned from him. And I value that. And I just hope that in 2 years' time, when we're singing Stolat, we're going to have to change the words, because we're wishing him certainly a lot more than 100 years of life on this earth. As a pleasure as always, I'm just shit. Right, I will begin. In Afghanistan, I had a Polish unit that worked for me, a section of GROM, Polish Special Forces. And the first night they arrived, the one major arrived. It was about 10 o'clock at night, we're working away. He comes in, sits down, and after about 2 minutes of conversation, I discovered, and he discovered, that he didn't speak English. And I looked at him and I said, Świat małe, I speak Polish. And so the rest of the tour, orders were given in Polish, and when the Polish contingent left, a small contingent of 8, small, I was tiny amongst them. One of them was 2 meters tall. So this contingent, when they left, we had a parade in Polish from our commander, everything, it was fantastic. It was a wonderful day in the 50-degree weather of Afghanistan. So, and to end that, I let them know that the final commander of the Samodzielny Kompania Grenadierów, the last commander of Polish SOF in the Second War, was alive and well in Canada. And they were delighted to hear that, because GROM perpetuates the memory and the history of the Polish commandos in the Second World War, and they are certainly proud of it, to find people like Pan Pieszczynowski. On the 12th of April 1945, soldiers of Maciek's 1st Armored Division, advancing from Netherlands, came into Germany after a long journey fraught with many problems, not the least of which was fighting a determined German enemy. And they reached prisoner of war camp 6B at Oberlangen in northern Germany. After several minutes of misunderstandings, likely owing to the British uniforms, the coveralls, and the mud on the soldiers, and finding Polish women prisoners of war on the other hand, they finally figured out they should communicate in Polish. And this is a theme that I will talk about in my presentation about how people can communicate. And I know that in our community in Ottawa, and I say that our community because I always feel at home with Poles, even though my family's been here since 1775, and as far as I know, I didn't have a drop of Ulani blood in my body, but who knows. So, they liberated 1,728 Polish women, female combatants, captives from the Army Krajowy, the home army from Warsaw, taken prisoner by the Germans. Well, an incredible story in itself, and ideally a future movie. The communication challenge is why I mentioned this vignette in history. The prison camp guards had already fled, and the women were waiting, not sure what fate would attend them. Fortunately, it was Colonel Piłsudski as part of his 1st Polish Armored Division, and it worked. So at the tactical level, where soldiers of different nations will often be interacting with Allied forces on the battlefield, such difficulties in identifying who your allies are could have disastrous consequences. And I'm talking about the situation where night fighting, poor radio communications are non-existent, where you're trying to communicate with your allies. They may have different vehicles. In a silhouette, they may look differently. Now, in the case of Maciek's army, they're not wearing rebetifkis. There's none of this confusion about hats. They're wearing berets, they're armored corps. Major Cassidy of Canada's Canadian Army's Algonquin Regiment, although it had a number of Polish-speaking Canadians in the unit, noted that during the Battle of the Bulge, after the period we're going to talk about, the stories of Germans who impersonated American officers and men in the Ardennes had been passed on. So when people heard English heavily accented, they were wondering, who are these people? Consequences we can only imagine in some cases may never be known, where casualties were taken. So if the Poles, because of accented English, were mistaken by Germans, how do we differentiate between German and Polish accent? It did not bode well for Polish speakers who had been working with the Polish allies since August 1944, Canadians of the 1st Polish Armored Division. So, Poles who spoke both English and Polish sufficiently to be able to communicate across boundaries with neighboring divisions and higher formations would be invaluable in the Canadian-Polish campaign in August 1940. Despite being outnumbered and standing alone, the Poles courageously managed to continue their fight against the German and Russian aggressors until the eventual surrender on the 6th of October 1939. As already mentioned by Mr. Kronitsky, 10th Armored Brigade, Colonel Maciek's brigade, fought successfully in the south. Many soldiers after the September campaign escaped to Romania and Hungary to fight on what became known as Polish forces in the west, Polskie Siły Zachodnie. Future commander of the 1st Polish Armored Division, Colonel Stanisław Maciek, had already commanded a cavalry brigade in September 1939, armored, mechanized. He went on to command a brigade and division in the French campaign of 1940 under French command. It was one of the last units to withdraw from the line of fire when they eventually reformed in England. He eventually arrived in, by the time of the German invasion, he had organized the 10th Mech Cavalry Brigade, Division Cavalerie Day, as part of the French Army, augmented by Polish immigrant families already in France. Large mining committee, as many of us are well aware, and while the French retreated in some cases without a fight, Maciek's brigade suffered 75% casualties, wounded and killed, substantial obviously. Upon the French capitulation, Maciek left France under a fictitious name, since the Germans were well aware of who he was and they were looking for him. Along with many of his compatriots, he arrived in the United Kingdom by a very circuitous route in late 1940 to continue the fight against Nazi Germany. In the United Kingdom, to carry on the fight against the Germans, Maciek and his soldiers faced a population who had little contact with Polish people and even less knowledge of the Polish Army's performance in the September campaign sufficed for these newspaper articles that were propagated by Polish cavalry attacking armored vehicles. This was their evidence at the time in Britain in 1940 for the mad courage or technical incompetence of the Poles, is how it was described in their newspapers. The Polish government in exile was formed in France after the war and subsequently moved to London, England. It consisted of a president, prime minister, cabinet, and other ministries typical of a ruling government, including Ministry of Defense and all the branches of an armed forces, Army, Navy, and Air Force. The strategic goal of the Polish government in exile was to return to Poland, of course, as the government in place after the defeat of Nazi Germany and the ultimate liberation of Poland. The Polish forces in the West, together with their leadership, were intended to be the nucleus for post-war Polish armed forces. On the 23rd of January 1940, General Władysław Sikorski, Prime Minister and Commander-in-Chief of the Polish Army in the West, made a declaration of Polish war policy. The recreation of the Polish Army in its greatest size is the most important and essential goal of the government. The Polish military personnel who were recruited from evacuees to Persia, and those with military experience who escaped via a variety of European routes, were well motivated to continue on the struggle. By the time of cessation of hostilities in 1945, Polish army units were ultimately formed both in the Middle East and Africa under 2nd Corps, referred to by Ambassador Konitsky, consisting of the 3rd Division, Dywizja Sierpsko-Karpacka, 5th Kiesowa Division Piechoty, an armored brigade, the 2nd, whose symbol you saw, the cat on the sleeve of the battle dress on that last slide, and a Polish 1st Corps consisting of the 1st Dywizja Pancerna and the 1st Samodzielna Brigada Składowa, Sosabowski's airborne forces. The subordination of the 1st Polish Armored Division under Canadian command also started with the ill-fated Warsaw Uprising, Powstanie Warszawskie, on the 1st of August 1944. A fact which would have weighed heavily on the minds of Poles, many of whom had relatives in the capital city of Poland, and whose liberation was, of course, their ultimate goal. All of these factors would have certainly been driving the Poles onwards in their zeal to defeat the German invaders and return home. When the 1st Polish Armored Division joined Lieutenant General Simmons, 2nd Canadian Corps, the 1st Canadian Army, its parent headquarters, consisted of 2 Canadian Corps and 1 British Corps. The 1st Canadian Army in Northwest Europe during the final phases comprised the largest field army ever under command of a Canadian general. The 2nd Canadian Corps, under Simmons' command, was comprised of following maneuver formations: 2 infantry divisions, 2nd and 3rd, 1 armored division, the 4th, the 1st Polish Armored Division, and a Canadian Independent Armored Brigade, the 2nd. Approximately 100,000 soldiers and 10,000 vehicles. The approximately 15,000 Poles represented the minority in the 2nd Canadian Corps. Following the large-scale invasion of Normandy of France on D-Day, 6th of June 1944, and the successful post-invasion consolidation and build-up of forces on the European continent, on the 1st of August 1944, the Polish Armored Division was landed at Normandy, France, in the vicinity of Caen, and assigned to 2nd Corps. The 1st Polish Armored Division's first operation was to be part of Operation Totalize on the 8th of August 1944. Corps Commander Lieutenant General Simmons met Maciek and his staff for the first time on the 4th of August 1944. Not ideal. Just before battle, the plan had been set. Within the 1st Polish Armored Division's ranks, Poles who spoke English well would have been rare indeed among those Polish veterans of the 1939 September campaign who succeeded in joining the formation in the United Kingdom. The language issue should have been more than familiar to Canadians, given our multinational population, albeit in that period in history our population was still predominantly of British origin and English speaking. The Canadian Army was for the most part dominated by English speaking officers who, with rare exception, were likely to be unilingual. Recruiting in Canada. In order to bolster the ranks of the Polish Army in exile, Brigadier General Bronisław Duch, a future divisional commander in Anders' 2nd Corps, was sent to Canada by the Commander-in-Chief of the Polish Army, General Sikorski, in March 1941. His task was to organize support for the expected eventual volunteers from the North American continent. Given that at this time the United States was not at war with Germany, the Polish recruiters would be based in Canada. Although potential Polish recruits in the United States were encouraged to join, as will later be seen, the results were somewhat disappointing. Another senior Polish officer, Colonel Arciszewski, was responsible for the administrative aspect of the recruiting campaign, including screening, cooperation with the Canadian military, to include medical examinations, payments, loans of equipment, and any and other logistical aspects. As a point of note, the recruiting center was located at 48 Blackburn in Ottawa at one point. There's a lovely Victorian house there. I'm not sure the occupants know what that was during the war, but it's a beautiful little house that's still there. So both Duch and Arciszewski were to cooperate with the Canadian counterparts in all aspects. The entire Polish military mission, consisting of Duch and approximately 30 officers and 60 other ranks, arrived in July 1941 at Windsor, Ontario, in order to take over command of the Polish training center Owen Sound. This picture. Recruiting was to take place in Canada, but under what authorities? After the early successful German army campaigns in the Second War, many European countries were overrun and their national governments and heads of states evacuated the governments in exile that were formed. Each country was determined its form of government in exile and located in either the United Kingdom or Canada, sometimes with diplomatic and military representation in both locations. What this meant to Canada was that a number of countries, initially to include Belgium, Netherlands, Norway, and Poland, and later to include Czechoslovakia and representatives of the Free French forces, were to carry out recruiting in Canada. The senior military legal advisor, the Judge Advocate General, provided clarification and guidance in March 1941 to the Canadian military headquarters, citing the Foreign Enlistment Act of 1937, which provided a legal basis for foreign recruiting activity on Canadian soil, and stating the provision, i.e. forcible inducement to enlist in the armed forces of a foreign country being a federal offense, does not apply in this case. The Polish Army was allowed to conscript in Canada starting in 1940. So the door was open, and conscription was to be conducted by the proper agencies. What happened in practical was that when people of Polish descent were in the Canadian Army, if they wished to join the Polish Army, they were released from the Canadian Army, re-enrolled in the Polish Army, and away they went. Later in the war, if somebody went to join the Canadian Army and was of Polish descent, they had to first go to the Polish recruiting office to see if the Poles wanted them. If they met the standard, then they'd carry on. So regulations governing recruiting Canada for the armed forces of Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Netherlands, Norway, and Poland were changed in 1942, which clarified those possessing dual nationality, Canadian and one of those countries, who have retained association with respect to speech, family, friends, and sympathies, would serve the common cause more efficiently in the forces of that country, should join that country. In the files in the Library and Archives of Canada, there are several thousand documents related to different recruits who would arrive at Army recruiting centers in Canada. And one case sticks in mind of an individual who arrived in Kamloops, British Columbia, and was from a part of Poland that at one point had been part of Ukraine when he left. And he was trying to explain to the recruiting officer where he was from. The recruiting officer had no idea. Because of the poor knowledge of Polish geography and Ukrainian geography, most of the queries were sent to Ottawa. For a historian, this is a boon in information to look at the real lives of individuals and what challenges, where they actually want to fight. And the recruiting officer of the Canadian Army is saying, well, are you Polish or Ukrainian? And it came down to retaining a sense of Polishness. You speak Polish at home, you're brought up in the Polish tradition. And that was the deciding factor on how people were directed to join the Polish Army. To say that it was complicated, when it comes to rules of recruitment, would have been an understatement. The Poles were very ambitious and aggressive in the recruiting, and I don't blame them. Shortfalls in units due to casualties, and the desired growth of units, the increased number of armored units, parachute brigade, and not just the Army, but the Air Force as well. So as a consequence, there was a lot of confusion, and recruits, some of which may have given up and joined the Canadian Army, but still fought for their country in a different army. Throughout the 9-month duration of Duke's recruiting mission, Canada was to provide 609 volunteers for the Polish Army. Included in this total were 8 who made it here from Japan to join the Polish Army in Canada to fight for Poland. Many joined after this period, but this is 609 is just the duration of the mission, Duke's recruiting mission. He closed the mission in 1942 and returned to England. One of the premises for the recruiting in Canada was based upon the recruiting of Haller's army during the First War, where approximately 24,000 Poles were trained at Niagara-on-the-Lake, went overseas as a substantial part of Haller's army. One of the issues that was missed was that the bulk of these people came from the United States, up into Canada and over. Most of the people of Polish descent were already in the Canadian Army. So the numbers were lower than they expected, but nonetheless enthusiastic and ready to fight. So even if a large number of native Polish speakers did reside in diaspora populations, when Commander-in-Chief Sikorski tried to recruit from both North and South America in order to liberate the homeland, he was discovered there was not a great interest in some of the people for the fate of Poland. For the people, yes, but Poland under what regime, under what history? People had left a long time ago, were proud of their Polishness, but understanding of what the fight was for. It had been overrun by Germany, very clear from the ambassador's comments. So the results for all recruiting missions set up in Canada, Brazil, and Argentina from 1941 to 43 yielded about 2,300 Polish immigrants who volunteered to fight in the Polish military. Amongst the Canadians who joined after General Duke had departed for command duties in the Polish Army were the Sakiewicz twins, Juliusz and Bogdan, sons of the then serving General Václav Stakiewicz and his wife Wanda, sister of General Roman Abraham. Then resident in Montreal, both boys were students at McGill University, who joined the Polish Army in Canada on 27 September 1943 on their birthday, and became part of Maciek's 1st Polish Armored Division. Bogdan, known as Bob, was wounded on the 11th of August at Falaise, and Julius, sometimes called Jules, on the 7th of November in the Netherlands. Both were awarded the Krzyż-Waleczny, the Cross of Honor, and both survived the war, happily. Jules was later to become a professor of mechanical engineering, specializing in the field of heat transfer at McGill University from 1950 until his death in 1976, when he was chair of the Department of Mechanical Engineering. By the time the 1st Polish Armored Division came under command of 2nd Corps, plans for the conduct of total eyes, as I already mentioned, were already well underway. Corps Commander Simmons was convinced that the task of capturing Falaise could be accomplished if he had sufficient forces. And with that in mind, he asked for an additional armored division as well as additional infantry. In response, he received the reconstituted British 51st Highland Division, because it had been destroyed previously in the 1940 campaign in France, 33rd British Armored Brigade, as well as Maciek's 1st Polish Armored Division. Despite any differences or misgivings that either may have had, Maciek and Simmons were embarking on combat operations as commander and subordinate on the 8th of August 1944. Any communications with them would have been through an interpreter or possible directly using limited French. While they were to meet for the first time, a unit called 4 Liaison Unit was set up to allow them to communicate. They were physically separated from the unit. When I met with Simmons' son and grandson, they said their grandfather's French was flyingly limited at best. So here's Maciek, who speaks French, German, Russian, Polish, and several other languages very well, but he doesn't speak English. So they have to communicate on the battlefield. Prior to the commitment in battle, Canadian formations, together with headquarters, were participants in a number of exercises. Conducted in March 43, Exercise Spartan was one of the biggest exercises ever held in the United Kingdom, with a total of 10 divisions participating. Importantly, when it came to future ops in Northwest Europe, the 4th Canadian Armed Division was still completing training. This was the unit under Kitching, was to fight alongside Maciek. And 1st Polish Armored Division was not assigned a specific role, so it was absent. The future commander of the 1st Canadian Army, General Carrar, was one of the 2 corps commanders. Lieutenant General Simmons was not in command of 2 corps at that time, and so played no role in the exercise. He actually was training to command 1st Division in Halecki in the Sicily campaign in 1943. The tendency of Canadian commanders, including Simmons, to have conferences and issue orders verbally would have been something that made comprehension by Maciek and his staff even more difficult. The volume of often very detailed administrative and operational instructions and orders that were produced by 2nd Canadian Corps presented a challenge to the non-English speaking Pole. The operational details contained within those tomes, and I say tomes literally, inch-thick documents, presented a challenge. The number 4 liaison headquarters unit's job was to translate those documents into Polish, and then translate Polish documents back into English for Simmons. The unit was about 138 people. There were 3 people within the unit that claimed some knowledge of Polish. They were all British people. One of them actually spoke Czech. One didn't speak Polish, but was married to a Pole. So the work fell upon one person in the liaison unit to translate everything. By the time of the employment of this unit, it seemed like good idea time had run out, and there was a report on the subject of military training courses being offered to the Poles in May 1944. It says, they must be extremely inefficient because they're not showing up for the courses. Given the imminent deployment of the Polish division into combat operations, it would be a reasonable assumption that last-minute preparation for war, English language skills would have been a secondary thought, if not tertiary, and given much more low priority. The liaison function suffered a loss even before the 1st Polish Armored Division had been deployed to France, when Chief of Staff Colonel Levitu and British Liaison Officer Major Wills were killed in a small caliber bomb attack. Both had been seconded to the 11th British Armored Division in France in July to get experience and to observe the ground on which Maciek's division was later going to fight. According to the nominal roll, as I mentioned, there were 3 listed as interpreters of the 138 people. Combat. 1st Polish Armored Division under Maciek had its baptism of fire during Op Totalize, which began on the 8th of August. Despite suffering initial casualties as a result of so-called, and I use that without any sarcasm, it's not friendly fire when it's upon you, from Allied aircraft, the Poles achieved victories at Mount Ormel in the town of Chambois. Compounding any problems encountered due to language and cultural misunderstanding was the actual geographical area in which the battles were fought. According to author and veteran of the battles, Canadian Blade Brigadier Dennis Whitaker, the Allies had no conception of the ruggedness of the country, nor had they done the appropriate equipment or special training to ensure hope of success in close-quarter combat. What that meant practically was that communications in this terrain was almost impossible by radio, and the training that occurred in England was on the plains of Salisbury where you could actually see your opponent. So in the Bocage territory in northwest France, very difficult. Large-scale operations that they had trained for would not work. And this was a subject of discussions between Maciek and Simmons as how to use armor properly. Simmons had never commanded armor in battle. Maciek had commanded mechanized armor in Poland in 39, in France in 40, besides the several cavalry battles and charges he was involved in the First War and then the Polish-Bolshevik War, 1919-1921. So he was trying to explain to somebody who didn't understand his language, here's how we should use armor or else we are going to be slaughtered. And the initial losses under Op Totalize brought out Maciek's observation. He didn't speak English enough to explain this. Simmons was, whether he's impatient or just many other things to get on with. And so Maciek's experience wasn't taken into account. In the Falaise pocket, 1st Polish Armored Division had the role of sealing the escape route of trapped German divisions and other units. The Poles were described as being the cork in the bottle, which held the Germans in until the Poles were relieved by Canadians. The leading plan of Maciek had been to seize Chambois, and there were some confusions about the name, but the Poles actually went to a different town with a similar name because of radio communication misunderstanding. They ended up going to a town that sounded very similar and ended up at the headquarters location of the 2nd German Waffen-SS Panzer Division, which they attacked successfully. That's not what the plan was. So by the time the gap was closed on August 21st, 1944, the 1st Polish Armored Division had for 6 days to fight ferocious and sustained attacks by 2 SS corps, often accompanied by Wehrmacht troops. In another vignette in this situation, an army in exile, as you are all aware, recruitment is always a challenge. And so when prisoners of war were taken from conscripted Germans, people were triaged to see who was Polish, who was from Silesia, who was from Pomerania, who are the Poles. And in the period of the campaign, 1944-1945, just over 1,000 Poles were recruited from Wehrmacht POWs into the Polish army, given a tunic on the battlefield and fought successfully. Regrettably, in some of the cases, casualties occurred immediately, so some of the records of who these people actually were don't exist. So, hero for the country, and for Mother Poland, it doesn't exist. There's no record, tragically. Polish losses in the struggle to close the gap were calculated at 1,441, including 466 killed in action. They offer some indication of the intensity of the fighting. In the Falaise gap, about 1,450, of which I say 466, about 20% of the combat strength of the division, the fighting strength. And this, the patch is the tactical sign of Maciek's 1st Polish Armored, and I found this treasure at a flea market in Canada, something that should never happen, but I'm glad to retrieve it and honor this in a collection amongst my other memorabilia from my humble career. The sappers of the Royal Canadian Army Engineers on the summit of Maczuga erected a temporary signpost which read simply, "A Polish battlefield." And in immediate days after the battlefield, people would come to tour in the quiet periods, and I don't mean military voyeurs, but soldiers to look at what had happened and commanders, the results of the campaign. It was unbelievable for most. Maciek's division, in close cooperation with his Canadian and British allies, pursued the German forces across northern France, not allowing them the opportunity to conduct a sustained defense. Back to the tactical lessons learned, keep fighting. The German concept early in the war was operational maneuver groups, regroup, reattack. The Poles had learned this, so did the Canadians by 44-45, and continued to pursue and put pressure on the German forces so they could not concentrate sufficient armor to actually defeat Polish Armored Division alongside of 4th Canadian Armored Division. The division crossed the Belgian frontier on the 6th of September 1944 and entered Ypres, initially encountering no opposition. After some sporadic fighting by German forces, a surrender was negotiated. Throughout October 1944, 1st Polish Army was engaged in heavy fighting across extremely difficult terrain with dikes and canals, each carefully prepared by the Germans in their defense. The Germans were taking advantage of the land in both Belgium and Netherlands, making sure that the Poles, or whoever the enemy was, would fight for every inch of the territory. It was at this point that the 1st Polish Armored Division became known as, by the Germans, the Schwarzen Teufel, the Black Devils, Czarne Diable, Black Devils, as a term of respect for Maciek's armored forces. On 30th of October 1944, it was probably Maciek's greatest triumph of the autumn campaign, the capture of Breda, Netherlands. The people of Breda are grateful to Maciek and how he captured the town with minimal damage. His plan involved the encirclement of the town and forcing a surrender, as opposed to the tried and true British and Canadian use of artillery bombardment to destroy the town and then advance it. To this day, Maciek is still armored and revered. In Breda, there are streets and plains named after him, and he's certainly how he thought of it. He spared the town based on his strategic and tactical knowledge as a cavalry officer. Fighting in the Netherlands was as hard as any fighting the division had experienced in France. In winter of 1944-45 was spent by the division on the south bank of the Rhine River, guarding a sector near Moerdijk in Netherlands. On the 6th of April 1945, the 1st Polish Armored Division was once again under the command of Canadian 2nd Corps. And on the 8th of April 1945, tanks of Maciek's division crossed the Rhine River at a town called Reis by means of a pontoon bridge. Poles were in Germany. On the 12th of April 1945, as mentioned, the POW camp was liberated, freeing the women hero combatants of 1944 Warsaw Uprising. And it's been my honor to meet many of these fine ladies. Some who are still with us and some who have passed. Amongst them, of course, being Pani Szpak, Pani Konopnicka, and many others. Honored to know them. On the 6th of May 1945, General Stanisław Maciek formally accepted the capitulation of German forces in Wilhelmshaven. Although the temptation for revenge in the last few days of the war may have been strong indeed, the words of Lieutenant Colonel Franciszek Skibinski characterized what was Polish military behavior. And I quote, "Mimo samej nienawiści do hitlerowców, muszę przyznać jedno, ci żołnierze umiejętności zachowywali się po żołniersku." Despite what was happening and the violence and intensity of the war, the Polish officers would behave in a military fashion, and so there was no vengeance. Despite the time he spent in the United Kingdom in organizing and training the 1st Polish Armored, Maciek and his men were not familiar with Simmons and the Canadian 2nd Corps, and neither group had the time to develop more than a passing acquaintance. During battles in close cooperation with their English and French-speaking allies and friends, the Poles and Canadians got to know one another under fire and grew up to respect each other and each other's military prowess. Soldiers from both countries overcame language barriers. Polish Canadians, such as the Stakiewicz twins, Bogdan and Juliusz, serving in Maciek's division, being invaluable in bridging that gap. Polish Canadian soldiers who serve in the Canadian military today follow in their footsteps, with Canadians serving alongside their Polish allies in Latvia and in other missions where NATO partners, Poland since 1999, are deployed. General Stanisław Maciek, who died on the 11th of December 1994, aged 102, is buried is what is certainly most appropriate for this patriotic soldier in the cemetery at the scene of one of his greatest triumphs. I took this picture in March 1995 when I was traveling to Poland to work with the Polish Armored Division that perpetuates the memory of Maciek. I arrived in Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, rented a car, drove down to the cemetery, took pictures, got them developed overnight, blown up, framed, arrived at the division with these pictures. Needless to say, the visit to the Union was a great case of towarzystwa, and it was most enjoyable. The story of Maciek and the Polonia, created in 45-46, is another chapter that deserves to be known to the West. The survival of a nation, the education of its youth in the diaspora, for whatever that would hold, in line with the song and the national anthem, Jeszcze Polska nie zginie, well, Poland does not perish as long as we live. Thank you for your attention. Dziękuję bardzo.